All right, our next speaker is Dr. Roberta Scherer from Johns Hopkins University, who's going to talk about the role of registries and repositories.
So, good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for asking me to talk. I will be talking about registries and repositories. There are many different kinds of registries and repositories, and I'm going to confine my talk to those involved or associated with clinical trials, with clinical research. And you'll see that I've added a subtitle to my talk, Promises Yet to Be Fulfilled. That's going to be the conclusion of my talk. I'm going to tell you where we started, where we're going, and where we are, but yet we're not where we want to be. First of all, conflict of interest. I have no financial conflicts of interest associated with this talk. What I'm going to do is, first of all, to define the problem for registries. Why were registries considered important? I'm going to talk about the history. How did they develop? When did they develop? And then I'm going to give you just a landscape of the current research on registries. A lot of work has been done in the last few years, and I want to just give you a flavor of that research. And then I'll switch to repositories and just give you a couple of examples of the kind of research that's being done on repositories, just some ongoing research. So the problem is that there has been harm to science from inaccessible trial information. This is a slide that was developed by Kay Dickerson, and I think it really summarizes a lot of the reason why we decided to try and have registries initially. There's a lot of duplication of research, not necessarily replication, but duplication. Lost opportunities for collaboration without knowing that someone else is doing the same trial. Other people would start a new trial, and more and more trials were being done on the same problem. Wasteful and under-reporting of research. People were not reporting. We all know about publication bias. It's a real problem. Or over-reporting of research. That is more trials that are reporting on outcomes that were not necessarily those that were initially described in the protocol. Or post hoc hypothesis testing, looking at the data and reporting on that. Inefficient, slow enrollment in clinical trials, meaning that those trials then were never published. But I think the really overriding concern is just the unethical exploitation of trial participants when the trial results are not made public. People enroll in trials because they want to further science, studies that have shown that. And so if those results are not made public in some way, it really is an ethical issue. This is the first trial register that I was able to find. It was 1967, that's 50 years ago, which is hard to believe. This is the collaboration between the National Institute of Mental Health and the George Washington Biometrics Laboratory. And this was a group of investigators, both in the US and in Europe. And they decided to put together, because they wanted to talk and collaborate, they put together what they called the Research Plan Report, which was a standard set of reporting forms that include many of the things we have in trials today, in trial registries today. Information about the trial, about the investigator, when the trial stopped and started, had a description of drugs, both the investigational drug and the comparator, characterization of the population, and a description of the protocol or design of the trial. This sounds like a registry. Levine in 1975 said, as the number of investigators reporting their studies in the United States and worldwide increases, the representativeness of the database and its usefulness in tracking trends over time will increase. Should regulatory agencies begin to routinely collect and tabulate their data on ongoing clinical trials, a truly representative database of use to the entire drug assessment community could result. So there was the germ of the idea of a register 50 years ago. This was iterated by Tom Chalmers as he talked about randomizing the first patient. This is 1977. And he said there ought to be, at the very least, some better method of centrally recording the sporadic individual trials now going on. Probably the turning point was this study by John Symes in 1986. He was pooling results of trials for ovarian cancer, comparing alkylating agent versus combination chemotherapy. And he found that when he looked at the published studies, there was a significant result showing that the alkylating agent was better. But when he looked at either the published and registered or all registered trials, the significance disappeared. And so this really showed us that not including trials that were not published made a difference in the pooled results and in the results that the evidence that was being used for clinical practice. This led to an editorial by Kurt Meinert in Controlled Clinical Trials, really advocating for prospective registration of clinical trials. The International Collaborative Group on Clinical Trial Registries formed thereafter in 1993 and came up with a list of recommended content for trial registries, including many of the items that we have today in clinicaltrials.gov and other trial registries, including the name, the condition. If you think about the population, it is a description of the population, the intervention, comparison, outcomes, the start and stop date, the duration of treatment, sample size, all of the things that we want to include in a trial registry today. Milestones in the history of registries then, and Lahana talked about this yesterday, but we in November, I think probably the starting point was November 1997 for the real push with the enactment of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act, requiring NIH to set up a data bank of information on clinical trials. And this resulted in 2000, in January 2000, in the launch of clinicaltrials.gov. And the trial registry in many ways languished until 2004, when the litigation between the state of New York and the GlaxoSmithKline, which showed that they were not reporting the results of adverse events for the SSRI, selective serotonin receptor inhibitors, showed that we really needed to have this information. A real turning point then was when the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJE, required prospective registration of clinical trials as a precondition for publication. And you can see that there was almost a doubling of the number of trials that were registered at that point. At the same, just a couple of years later, there was the launch of the WHO International Clinical Trial Registry Program, which is a platform for all the clinical trials in worldwide to put their information. So we moved on to, September 2007 was the enactment of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Amendment Act, or FDAA, which expanded registration requirements and enacted penalties for noncompliance. And what FDAA did was to require registration within 21 days of enrolling the first participant, and it also allowed for submission and reporting of trial results. But you'll see it took a while to really get to the reporting of the basic results and adverse events, because the enactment of the Act did not necessarily immediately change the clinicaltrials.gov. It took a while for these rules to actually go into place. And you can see that September 2010 was when all the rules were supposed to be in place, but they actually weren't yet in place by then. They were actually, the final rule just came out last year in terms of defining what trials should be registered in requiring NIH, any trial funded by NIH to be registered. Also, more recently, we have the European Medical Agency expanded the European Clinical Trial Registry to include results. And just last year, they began to accept results. So this is the timeline for registered trials at clinicaltrials.gov. I took this off the clinicaltrials.gov website in February 23rd, just recently. And you can see we have about 235,000 trials registered. A little bit of an upswing with the ICJMA. Here's when FADA happened, but you can see it's a fairly steady growth. The WHO International Clinical Trials Registry, as I said, is a platform. And what this registry does is it downloads data, or it has data submitted from various different registries. These are worldwide, includes the Australian, New Zealand Clinical Trial Registry, Brazilian, Chinese, German, French, Japan, just a lot of different clinical trial registries. They don't do the registry itself, but they are a portal. They're the gateway to access information on other trial registers. So, can trial registries provide the information we need? We had the problem that we had, there was no, data was inaccessible about clinical trials. In theory, trial registries can provide information on the design of the trial, on conduct, the start and completion dates, the efficacy and the harms. But is the information that we have in clinical trials sufficient? Is it adequate to serve the original purpose of registration, is to allow us to use data in systematic reviews to support the evidence for clinical practice? So, I did a search of a lot of the existing literature on trial registries. This was not complete, it was not systematic, but I think it gives us a flavor of where the research is at this point. So the first kind of question that I wanted to know was, where are the trials being registered? How many are being registered? What proportion, that is? And when are they being registered in relation to study start? Is the information in the registry complete? So where are, this is international, the ICTPR, the WHO registry platform, where are they registered? This is work that was done by Virgiver and Gersi. And as you can see, the majority of trials are registered on clinicaltrials.gov. Clinicaltrials.gov includes not just US trials, but trials worldwide. But there's a substantial proportion of trials registered in other registries. This was a sample of 220, a random sample of 222 trials in 2002. How many trials are being registered? So there are a lot of people who have looked at this. Now, the way that people have looked at this question is to take a sample of trials that are in a journal, of some kind of journal, and then to see what proportion of those trials actually had a registration number, how many could be found in a register. As I was going through, I saw that there was a wide variation, but I found there's a pattern. You know, we humans try to find patterns in things. But I think this is probably more an indication of not how many trials are registered, but how good are journals at actually enforcing registration. Because if we look, we can see that the BMJ, JAMA, or BMC journals have almost all the trials that are published in those journals are registered. The ICJME trials are journals actually have a fairly high proportion of trials that are registered. And as we go down, we can see that journals that are considered high impact, that is, journals that have a high impact factor, the top impact factor, Thomson Reuters impact factor, tend to have a larger proportion of trials registered. And this can be either the top general medicine journals or the top high impact journals within a specialty such as rheumatology or anesthesiology, down to just RCTs in a specialized area. But there's a wide variation. Overall, if one just simply adds it up, we can see that among trials that are published, 60% of all these trials are registered. But as I said, this was looking at journals, and so that may be a select sample. We don't know how many trials are registered that aren't published. So we did some work. We looked at abstracts. Now, we know that about 40% of abstracts are not published. In 2007, the American Association for Research in Vision and Ophthalmology, or ARVO, began requiring a registration number for every abstract of a clinical trial that was submitted for their annual meeting. And we found that we searched all of the abstracts to find reports of randomized controlled trials, and we found 496. Of those, 63%, or 312, actually were registered. The vast majority were registered in clinicaltrials.gov. So I think, again, this is not, going back to the very beginning, what we really need and what I couldn't find was a study starting with the protocols and looking to see how many were registered. Is the information in the trial registries complete? This is a study done by Pranic, and looking at at 9 of the WHO minimum data set items. And she found that there was missing information on the title and on the secondary outcomes. I'll give you a preview, but there's a lot of problems with secondary outcomes in the reporting of registers. But her finding is not necessarily uniform because people have already also looked at whether the primary outcome have found different information in terms of primary outcomes. And they're often infrequently reported or inadequately reported in registries. 2 studies that were done in 2011, so remember this is going to be probably trials that were done before the FADA ruling, and so and also before a lot of those definitions for what should be reported and how it should be reported were included in clinicaltrials.gov. And about one study found 39% and another 22% of primary outcomes were not reported. If we go on to look at whether they were reported adequately, we find later studies looked and examined the adequacy of the reporting. But again, the same sort of proportions, anywhere from 20 to 30%. This last study by Colleen shown that included inadequately were 36 primary outcomes that were reported after the study was completed. So plenty of room for bias, deciding what your outcome is after the study was completed. Or the time was undefined or unclear. So the next question is how many trials are registered prospectively? That is within the 21 days. And this is an interrupted time series done by Law. And as you can see, up until 2005, when the journal mandated, when the ICJMA journal mandate was enacted, there was pretty much no difference, not very little difference in terms of trials that were registered before the trial started or at some point afterwards. Looking at 2005, we can see a large number of trials that were expected to be registered that then were registered and so were and we're well outside the 21-day limit. But we can see that as time goes on, this is the FDA, we can see that the total number of all trials registered is decreasing, but the number of trials that are registered within the 21 days is steadily increasing. So the next question has to do with publications. Okay, so we did look at how many published trials were registered. Now we want to look at how many registered trials are published. Okay, this is a systematic review that I was involved in, working with the Open Project, looking at registered trials and looking at the publication of registered trials. And so as the systematic review, so all of these studies looked at a sample of trials that was in a register, either clinicaltrials.gov or ICTPR. And you can see there's a fair amount of, there's some variation across different studies, but overall, about 54% of registered trials are published with a confidence interval of 95% confidence interval of 42 to 66%. So we still have, so that is probably, that in some sense that's good news, because it means that we're finding 45% of trials that aren't being published, but we now know about them because they are being registered. We also wanted to know when the trials are registered. Remember, the results were supposed to be reported within 1 year of completion of the trial. That was according to the FDA regulations. And so different investigators have looked at when trials are registered. And overall, we can see that, that was when trials should be reported within 1 year. Sorry, mixed that up. Looking at when trials are published, because the two time points are important, because the regulation is 1 year after the trial is completed. Trial results need to be reported in clinicaltrials.gov. And so there's concern as to whether that allows sufficient time for those people who want to publish the data. But we see that the median time to publication after completion of the trial is about anywhere from 19 to 23 months, with slightly over a year to about 2 to 2.5 years. And then we go to results. Results are required. So our authors reporting trial results in clinicaltrials.gov. When are they reporting them? And when they're reported in both, do the outcomes agree or do the harms agree? So we can look and we can see how many registered trials are completed, have results. You can see it's about, there's about 24,000 as of February 23rd. And if we compare how many trials were registered at the same time point, it's about 10%. But those trials may not necessarily have been completed. They may not be subject to the FDA ruling. And so this is a comparison that Scherer did, looking at completed trials with at least one U.S. center, so under FDA ruling. And we can see that there's still a substantial portion of trials, of completed trials, that you have not yet posted results. Timing to report. Now, there's some penalties involved for not complying with this ruling. And so Anderson looked at the time to reporting following the FDA regulations by the sponsor of the trial. And we can see that industry, which is the blue line, has a big up bump at 1 year, which is expected. They need to get their trial results registered. On the other hand, those of us in academia are not doing so well. NIH-funded studies, well, it's pretty straight. And other federal agencies, again, fairly lackadaisical. timing to report, the median for trials under the FDAA requirements, 16 months. So not quite within a year, so about half of the trials are not having results reported within the time frame. NIH trials, 23 months, and other trials, 21 months, so almost 2 years to report the trial. So this is what it seems to be happening, is that the trials are reporting results at about the same time they're doing their publications. But we're also interested in discrepancies. How many discrepancies are there in primary outcome results? This is a systematic review done by Jones. And you can see there's a huge variation in discrepancies in terms of the results that were reported in primary outcomes. The median is 31% of trials have some discrepancy in the primary outcome. Looking at the subset of trials using prospectively registered primary outcomes, it's even higher, it's 41%. What kinds of discrepancies are there in the primary outcomes? So this was a classification system developed by Matthew, and we can see that of almost 1,300 trials, 13% of them published articles with a new primary outcome, so one that had not been included in the register. Another 9% included a primary outcome. The registered primary outcome was not reported anywhere in the published article. Other mismatches were the registered primary outcome was reported as a secondary outcome in the publication, or the published primary outcome was one of the secondary outcomes. And then the last category is just the timing was different. So lots of discrepancies in the primary outcome. How often, though, does this make a difference? How often does the discordance make a difference? And the problem with this is it's really hard to compare, because if they're not the same, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to compare the outcomes, and so the number of trials where people are able to compare it is fairly small. But in those cases where they did compare it, about 50% of the primary outcomes favored a statistically significant result when it was discordant. Interestingly, this did not seem to be restricted to industry trials, which people would tend to think. It was pretty even. Some people found that it was a preponderance of industry trials. Other investigators found that it was academic. So it really didn't seem to make a difference. Other discrepancies between the registry and publication. People have looked at various outcomes or various other aspects. As I said before, there's a large number of discrepancies in the secondary outcomes that are reported. Some in design, some in eligibility criteria, intervention, sample size, differing by a certain proportion. But probably of concern are the serious adverse events. So this is a study by Tang looking at serious adverse events that were reported both in publications and in clinicaltrials.gov. And I think it's very disturbing that we're not seeing all of the harms from clinical trials in the publications, but we are finding them in clinicaltrials.gov. So it's very good that we're able to see what are the harms of intervention. This is something that's really important to study participants to know what are the problems. So can we get a full picture in terms of publication, between the publications and the results? So Haitu found that there were trials that were registered but had no results reported, and that had no publications, about 29.5%. We also looked at this with 154 RCTs that were identified from the abstracts that I mentioned previously, and we found that about 23% of these 35 of 154 had neither publications nor results posted. However, 25 of those publications were abstracts. And if you don't count the abstracts, we've heard how it's difficult to find meta-analyzable data from abstracts, then 39% of trials have no results and have no publications. So we still don't have the information that we need for those trials. So I'm going to talk a little bit more. This is from the Research Waste Conference. I like looking at this diagram because it tells me where does all the information about clinical research come from. And we've talked about study registration. We've talked about the primary report, that is the publication, a little bit about conference abstracts. But now I want to switch to the interim and final study reports, the clinical study reports that Dr. Dickerson talked about yesterday, and the statistical analyses and summary, things that would be included in a repository. So just a couple of examples in terms of repositories. Schwartz looked at drugs at FDA and compared the outcomes in 100 trial. There were 137 outcomes. In terms of primary outcomes, there were 134 that were mentioned in both sources. Good, so there's not much discrepancy there. 130 of them had concordant definitions, so that's good. And 107 had concordant results. That's not so good. But in terms of secondary outcomes, less than half of the secondary outcomes that were included in clinicaltrials.gov were actually reported in drugs at FDA. Also of concern were the serious adverse events. 96 of the trials had at least one or more serious adverse event. 82 of these were reported in clinicaltrials.gov, but only 14 in both sources, and of those 14, 7 were discordant. We also have a story from the Tamiflu systematic reviews. This is a Cochrane systematic review done by Doshi and Jefferson. And initially, their finding was that Tamiflu, which is a treatment for people with flu, actually prevented some of the major complications and shortened the time that people were indisposed. After a great deal of effort, they were able to obtain internal company documents, things that one would expect to be in a registry. And the additional information they found were more trials that were done on the topic. They found some adverse events that were not reported in the articles. They found that some adverse events had been reported as simple complications and not as adverse events, and so changed the interpretation of the information. They found some trials that were published 10 years after completion. And importantly, they found some trial details that were vital to the interpretation, looking through all of these clinical, these CSRs, the clinical study reports. And what they found was, once they included this and updated their systematic review, they found that the only advantage of taking Tamiflu is that it reduced the length of being indisposed by about half a day. So made a difference in terms of the interpretation and the evidence used for use of this Tamiflu for flu victims. Another repository is the Clinical Study Data Request. This is a repository where these 13 drug companies have agreed to deposit their data, their clinical study reports. And so Isabelle Boutron, who talked yesterday, she does a lot of things, but one of the other things she did was to look, how much of this data could you actually get? So she looked at 4 different drug companies, Roche, Lilly, Boehringer Ingelheim, and GlaxoSmithKline. Looked at trials that were registered in clinicaltrials.gov. And looked to see how many of those registered trials were actually listed in CSDR, And as you can see, you know, not overall, probably about half, with a few more from GlaxoSmithKline. But then among those, how much of the data was available? How many data sets were available? And you can see there's a drop. So we only have about a quarter of the data available for the 3 drug companies, maybe 60%. But this only covers about 1/3 to 2/3 of all the study participants that have been involved in these trials. So I don't think she went on to actually pull the data. Maybe she has by now. No, not yet. To see whether the data was actually usable, because there's also the problem of just because you have data doesn't mean it's usable. You need to have the metadata, the information about the trial. You need to understand what's going on. So lots of additional information is necessary. There are lots of other different types of repositories, and it was impossible to find them all. So I just want to give you sort of a flavor of the kinds of repositories that are available on the internet. There's YODA, the Yale Open Data Access, done by Yale, and this is where Johnson & Johnson deposits trial information, and they use a trusted intermediary, that is someone who actually looks to see whether the data, whether the request for data is reasonable. Dryad, repository used by BMJ Open. Figshare and Zenoba are open source software. Probably the most interesting one is the Scientific Data, which calls itself an open access online only journal for descriptions of scientifically valuable data sets. And they have very standard definitions for including the metadata. We also, I also found a study looking at protocols, because that's really the beginning start. And this actually was a little disturbing, because we could see that of the primary outcomes in the protocols, there was not concordance between what was included in clinicaltrials.gov. 65 trials, 81 common outcomes, but you can see that there were 14 primary outcomes added and 25 omitted, going from the study protocol to clinicaltrials.gov. And of course, the kind of discordance that we have seen already in terms of looking at the publications in clinicaltrials.gov. This is also a study done by Wiesler looking at trials and other studies that they obtained for a health technology assessment. 268 studies with 468 outcomes. Looking at publications, CSRs, and repositories, there are only 29 studies in common. But lots of information, probably more information was available in the CSRs. 76% of them had primary outcome data, as opposed to publications with 31% and the repositories with 56%. This led Wiesler to say it's insufficient to aim for a journal publication rate of 100%. What we need is public availability of CSRs, and thus of documents presenting trial results to a level of detail required for full evaluation of a trial. You saw this slide yesterday. CSRs, again, providing more detailed information. This is the work of the MUD study that Dr. Dickerson showed you. And just, again, reiterating that of the fully described outcomes, those that have all of the components of an outcome, the information is found primarily in the CSR. So, trial registration with results reporting in repositories aim to provide a picture of all trials initiated, their history, and important trial data. And we've learned a lot from the existing registries. I think we've come a ways. We know about the conduct, we know about reporting, we know about trials that we would never have known about before. The reproducibility of results across publication, registers, repositories, and protocols is problematic, and discordance is somewhat common, so that's a little disheartening. Among the available sources, the CSRs appear to provide the most comprehensive information but they are limited by accessibility and by restriction to drug trials. So we don't have any information on studies that do not involve drugs with So I thought I would put this in. We had a couple of slides yesterday where we talked about research being false, but I wanted to say that John Ioannidis also has this essay, how to make more published research true. And as I was looking at this, I was struck by the number of things that we talked about yesterday as possible solutions. Large-scale collaborative research and adoption of a replication culture. Registration, not just of studies, but of protocols, of analysis codes, of data sets, of raw data and results, and sharing, which we're going to hear later about today. Reproducibility practices, things that are aimed at reproducibility. And then containment of conflicted sponsors and authors, more appropriate statistical methods. We talked about that yesterday. Standardization of definitions and analyses. Stringent thresholds for claiming discoveries or successes. Improvement of study design standards. Improvements in peer review, reporting, and dissemination of research. We spent a lot of time talking about that. And we also talked about better training of the scientific workforce in methods and statistical literacy. So I'd like to close by saying, although the potential promise of registers and repositories has yet to be fulfilled, we've come a long way, baby, since the first register in 1967. Thank you.